I will now introduce our first debater for the evening, which is Dr. Norman L. Geisler. He's professor of theology at Dallas Theological Seminary. He received a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees at Wheaton College and Graduate School. He received a Bachelor of Theology degree from Detroit Bible College and the Doctor of Philosophy at Loyola University in Chicago. He has taught at Detroit Bible College and is currently professor of systematic theology at Dallas Theological Seminary. His publications include Philosophy of Religion and A Creator in a Courtroom, Scopes 2. He was called as an expert witness for creation at the Arkansas Creation Trial. He is a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, American Scientific Affiliation, and the American Philosophical Society. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Norman L. Geisler, our first debater.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be a participant in this dialogue this evening, particularly with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Philip Kitcher. He's one of the most brilliant, informed, and articulate of all of the anti-creationists who is speaking today. His book is perhaps the best critique of creation science in print, so I consider it a great privilege because tonight you will hear one of the finest defenses of the evolutionary viewpoint and critique of creationism in this dialogue. In giving an affirmative answer to the question before us, let me begin with a quote from Charles Darwin, Origin of Species. For I am well aware that scarcely a single point is discussed in this volume on which facts cannot be adduced, often apparently leading to conclusions directly opposite to those at which I have arrived. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question, and this is here impossible. Charles Darwin believed in giving the evidence both for and against the evolution and creation hypotheses. The reasons opposing teaching both models in a balanced way in the public school were stated very clearly by the Arkansas judge William Overton in his landmark decision January 5th, 1982. They can be categorized into two: the religious reasons and the scientific reasons. The judge gave several religious reasons for rejecting creation, and they can be enumerated as follows. Creation entails the supernatural cause, which is religion. Creation from nothing is inherently religious. Creation comes from a religious book, the Bible, and creation implies a creator, a God, who is the object of worship. Let me respond to each of these, one after the other. First, the judge said that creation entails the supernatural cause, which is religious. It's true that creation science involves the supernatural cause. However, limiting science to a purely natural cause is a mistake for historical, philosophical, scientific, educational, and legal reasons. One, historically, it is widely acknowledged that the belief in a supernatural cause is the very origin of modern science. Indeed, for the first 2.5 centuries of modern science, 1620 to 1860, most of the leading lights in science believed that the universe gave evidence of a supernatural creator. One need only to recall names like Bacon, Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Agassiz, Maxwell, Mendel, and Kelvin, all of whom believed in a supernatural cause of the universe and life. Philosophically, it is difficult to justify an approach to origins in science wherein only one of two alternate positions is given a hearing. It's of the essence of philosophy to be open to opposing views. Furthermore, not allowing a creationist explanation of origins is contrary to the present educational practice in high school humanity philosophy classes. Here, arguments both for and against the Creator are presented. I fail to see why the same procedure should not also be allowed in science class. Thirdly, Scientifically, there are some serious objections to disallowing minority views. Creationism is a minority view today among scientists. Remember Galileo? His was a minority view. Remember also Velikovsky? His was a minority view. Admittedly, scientific creationism is a minority position, but without minority views, there would be no possibility of scientific progress, since all new ideas are minority views when first presented. Educationally, serious oversights are involved in forbidding creation science and entrance into the science classroom. With the exception of a few vocal zealots for evolution, most serious-minded scientists recognize that evolution is not a proven fact. It is at best only a theory or a hypothesis. Some evolutionists have even admitted that it's a myth or a matter of faith. In any case, it is possible that evolution may be wrong and creation may be right. If this is so, then a court decision which forbids teaching creation will have the consequence of legislating the impossibility of teaching what may be admittedly true. I find it difficult to believe that fair-minded scientists are willing to say, in effect, creation science may be true, but we will not allow it to be taught anyway. Have we reached the point in American education that we have so narrowly defined science that we have eliminated the possibility of discovering the truth? Legally, to insist only natural causes can be discussed in science class is to favor one religious philosophical point of view, the one represented by secular humanists, a naturalistic point of view. Secular humanism is a religion. It declared itself a religion, and the Supreme Court has noted it is a religion and is protected by the First Amendment. But three of the essential beliefs of the religion of secular humanism are: there is no creator, there was no creation of life and man, and there are no supernaturally caused events. Therefore, to insist that only these points of view be taught is to establish the essence of secular humanism in the public school science classrooms. Therefore, these naturalistic points of view, which favor secular humanism, would be a violation of the First Amendment. To be sure, these are not the only tenets of the humanist religion, but if the court can declare creation science is religious for teaching about these points, then there is no reason that they should not be called religious when the secular humanist view on these points of view is presented. This is especially so when this is the only view that is presented. Second, creation from nothing, said the judge, is inherently religious. The Arkansas judge affirmed that creation of the world out of nothing is the ultimate religious statement because God is the only actor. But this pronouncement is a case of special pleading, for there are only two basic views in the origin of the universe. Either the universe is eternal or it came into being out of nothing. But why should we legislate the belief in an eternal, uncaused universe is not religious, but the belief that it was caused is essentially religious? Some religions hold to one of these views and some to the other. It is special pleading to call one of these two views religious and not the other. Furthermore, if the court pronounces a view religious because it is consistent with some religions, then most cosmological and ethical beliefs ever held by mankind are religious. For most such beliefs were held as part of some religion in time past. Surely we do not want to forbid teaching school children that rape, murder, and cruelty are wrong simply because many religions also hold these views to be wrong. Why then should one claim that creation is religious simply because some religions believe in it? Teaching what is compatible with certain religious beliefs is not necessary to teach religion. Evolution is compatible with the beliefs of religious humanists, Hindus, and Buddhists. But teaching the scientific evidence for biological evolution is not necessary to teach that this is a religion. Likewise, simply because creation is compatible with certain forms of Christian religion does not mean that to teach the scientific evidence for creation is to teach religion. The judge also argued that creation implies a creator, which is an object of worship, where evolution does not. It's true that creation implies a creator, and the creator is often an object of religious worship. However, it does not follow that positing a creator as an inference from scientific observation is therefore more religious than not positing one. First of all, it is now widely accepted, even by the courts, that belief or non-belief that there is a creator or God is not the essential element of what is meant by religious. Indeed, the courts have consistently upheld the religious rights of atheists. Furthermore, even the belief that there is a creator is not necessarily religious. Aristotle inferred a creator from observations about the cosmos, yet he did not worship this unmoved mover. The same is true of Plato's creator. He functioned as a world designer, but not as the object of ultimate worth. That Plato reserved for the good. Other religions, such as Gnosticism and many pre-literate religions, do not worship the creator of the universe. Furthermore, if we must eliminate any object of worship or ultimate commitment from study in the public schools, then we should also eliminate rocks from geology class, because some people have worshipped rocks. Certainly all icons must be forbidden in history and archaeology studies, since they were idols to somebody. And what devastation we must do to the art classes. No Buddhas, no virgins will be allowed. All crucifixion and biblical scenes would have to be forbidden. As a matter of fact, most great art up to the 18th century has religious significance and would therefore have to be disallowed. Likewise, if the Arkansas judge is right, then we must not present any historical evidence for the existence of either Buddha or Christ in history class, for both are object of religious devotion to millions. The fallacy of this kind of reasoning is apparent, for it is not the reference to an object which some people worship which makes it religious, but whether it is presented as an object of worship or ultimate commitment. We do not forbid the study of natural forces in science classes, such as rain, wind, and sun, simply because many pre-literates have worshipped these forces. We simply insist that these natural forces be studied in an objective way without attempting to evoke a religious response or commitment to them. Likewise, Buddha and Christ can be studied from an objective historical vantage point without presenting them as objects of religious devotion. Indeed, the courts have never ruled that studies about religion or religious beings are unconstitutional. It's the teaching of religion which is considered illegal, not teaching about religion or religious objects. The idea of a cause or designer of the universe is religiously innocuous when presented as a scientific explanation of origin. It is even more so when it must be presented as only one of two possible ways of explaining the data. How can teaching two possible explanations be establishing one? It should be pointed out that these features of presenting creation only from an objective scientific approach and only as one of two opposing views are part of the creation-evolution debate in which we are engaged. Fourthly, the judge said the creation view comes from a religious source, the Bible. Therefore, it's religious. This is a good example of the genetic fallacy. First of all, suppose the source of creation is the Bible. If this makes it religious, then modern science itself is religious, for it's well established that the biblical doctrine of creation was the source of modern science. This is acknowledged by Yaki, this is acknowledged by Whitehead, this is acknowledged by a landmark article by M.B. Foster in 1934. Secondly, if we must reject a scientific theory because it comes from a religious source, then we must reject many archaeological discoveries. For the source and inspiration of many Near Eastern archaeological finds came from the Bible. Further, we would have to reject Kekule's model of the benzene molecule, since he got it from a vision of a snake biting its tail. And we must also consider the alternating current motor of Tesla to be unscientific because he got it while having a vision reading a pantheistic poet, Goethe. However, it is obviously wrong to reject a scientific model because of its source, even if the source is religious in nature. Scientists are not concerned about the source of a model, but rather the adequacy of the model in explaining the data. Has anyone ever rejected Socrates' philosophy simply because his inspiration came from a Greek prophetess, the Oracle of Delphi? Or has anyone refused Descartes' rationalism into public classroom simply because his inspiration came from 3 dreams on November 10th, 1619? Likewise, no fair-minded person should reject the idea of creation simply because it comes from the Bible. If it provides an adequate scientific explanation of the data, that's all that we should be concerned with. The judge also gave scientific reasons for rejecting creation science. He said, the essential characteristics of science are, 1, it's guided by natural law. 2, it has to be explanatory by reference to natural law. 3, it's testable against the empirical world. 4, its conclusions are tentative, not necessarily the final word. And 5, it's falsifiable. Now, the first 2 of these have already been discussed. They wrongly limit science to natural forces and thus unconstitutionally favor naturalistic religions. To summarize our objection to defining origin science in a purely naturalistic way, we would point out that 1, it's contrary to the origin and history of science. 2, it is not scientific to insist on only natural causes for events of origins. It's naturalistic, which is a philosophy or a religious point of view. 3, it is scientifically unfruitful to insist on purely natural causes for origin events where the evidence calls for intelligent intervention. 4, it hinders the progress of science to squelch minority views. Refutation, not condemnation, is the way of a critical thinker. 5, to allow only naturalistic causes of origin is to establish essential beliefs of a humanistic religion which violate the First Amendment. The 4th criteria of the judge is correct, but it does not invalidate creation science. No theory of science is absolute by the very nature of the case, nor do creation scientists, as scientists, claim the scientific arguments for creation reach the level of proven fact. However, the same cannot always be said for evolutionists. Carl Sagan said in Cosmos, quote, evolution is not a theory, it is a fact, end quote.
3-minute warning.
One evolutionist witness at the Arkansas trial insisted that science is always tentative, yet he claimed evolution was a fact. However, he found it considerably difficult to explain to the court what a tentative fact is. The 3rd and 5th criteria for science given by the judge may be considered together. There must be some way to test a scientific theory. What the court overlooked, however, is that strictly speaking, there is no empirical way to test either creation or evolution. Both are views about past singularity, but empirical tests have to do with present regularity. Hence, neither observation nor repetition is a part of a scientific view with regard to origin. Present empirical science deals with observation and repetition, but past events of singularity are not repeated in the present and were not observed. Therefore, they do not fit the character of empirical science. They fit rather the character of a forensic science. There are no adequate religious or scientific views for eliminating creation science from the public school science classroom. In fact, at the Scopes trial in 1925, Clarence Darrow, the ACLU attorney, put it very forcefully and very succinctly. He said, and I quote, "It is bigotry for public schools to teach only one theory of origin. And if it was bigotry in 1925 to teach only one theory of origin when evolution was being excluded, it is still bigotry in 1985 to teach only one theory of origin when creation is being excluded." I thank you.
Our second debate tonight will be presented by Dr. Philip S. Kitcher, who is the head of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Minnesota. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree at Cambridge, a Doctor of Philosophy at Princeton University. He has taught zoology at Harvard University and philosophy at Vassar College, University of Vermont, University of Michigan, and presently at the University of Minnesota. His publications include Abusing Science, The Case Against Creationism. His articles have appeared in many philosophy publications, and he is a member of the editorial board of Philosophy of Science. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Philip S. Kitcher.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you. And I'd like to thank Dr. Geisler very much, both for his kind words about me and for an excellent and very smooth presentation. Refutation, he said, not condemnation, is the mark of good thinking. Well, I hope this evening I'm going to give him what he wants. I hope I'm going to give him a refutation and not a condemnation. The issue before us tonight is whether the high school science curriculum should be modified so as to include something called balanced treatment of two models. One, the familiar evolutionary model, another, a less familiar model, the creation model. Dr. Geisler hasn't yet told us what that is. I'll tell you in a minute. First of all, though, I want to get out of the way some red herrings which may hang people up. The first of these came up in the context of Dr. Geisler's opening remarks. We have to disabuse ourselves at the very beginning of the idea that somehow there's an intimate tie between evolution and something called secular humanism or atheism or something like that. There are very many people in the world, perhaps the majority of all Christian religions, who accept the theory of evolution. Darwin is, after all, buried in Westminster Abbey, the main church of the Church of England. He's been lying there for over 100 years. It seems to me that if Dr. Geisler and his friends are right, then the Church of England has got to be very confused about some important issues. What is correct is that the evolutionary account of the origins of life is at odds with the religious ideas of a very particular group of people. People who feel compelled to take the opening chapters of Genesis literally. In my judgment, these folks are treating the Bible in a very peculiar and misguided way. They're treating it as if it were a scientific text, rather than a work of profound moral and spiritual significance. Evolutionists are not in the business of denying God. What they're in the business of is denying that God acts in a particular way in the history of life, just as chemists are in the business of denying that God acts to shuffle the molecules around when chemical reactions take place. Chemistry isn't atheistic, it's non-theistic. Evolutionary biology isn't atheistic, it's non-theistic. Now, a second point that often occurs to people when they hear about this issue is, why make a fuss? Why not give the fundamentalists what they want? This, I think, is to make a mockery of our educational system. I will be arguing in a minute that there's no more reason for giving balanced treatment to creationism than there is for giving balanced treatment of the flat earth theory or the old view that diseases are caused by imbalances among four humors. When we teach our young people, we owe it to ourselves and to them to be honest with them. What honesty involves is telling them when an issue is genuinely open and equally telling them when an issue has been settled. When the evidence on one side of a point is really conclusive, then we owe it to people to let them know about it. That is the case in this debate. So the real question on which we have to concentrate is whether the claim I have just made is correct. Let's take the two models and compare them with respect to the evidence. First of all, we have to know what the two models are. Now, one of Dr. Geisler's friends, Dr. Duane Gish, likes to make a joke about evolution. He calls it the fish-to-gish theory. Well, we can use the joke to point the difference between these two different views. He holds the gish-to-gish theory, evolutionists hold something like the fish-to-gish theory. Okay, creation scientists believe that there have always been, from the very beginning of life, dogs and cats and bats and rats and turtles and gishes. Evolutionists believe that first there came rather simple marine organisms, later simple kinds of fish, later still amphibians, later still reptiles, and at the very end we get mammals and birds and reptiles and fish and marine invertebrates and Dr. Gish, all mixed up together. Okay, now, creationists usually don't like telling people the details about what they believe. And to see what they believe, we have to take a look at some of the statements to which they subscribe. Could I have the first slide, please? Have I got the first slide? Oh, okay. Okay, here's a statement of the Creation Research Society. It corresponds fairly closely to statements or to parts of the statements that were introduced in the Arkansas Act, at which Dr. Geisler testified. Okay, now, you can't read this? Okay. Well, the important parts of this are the commitment, on the one hand, to the idea that all basic types of living things were made by direct creative acts of God during creation week, as described in Genesis, and that there was a great flood, a Noachian deluge. It was a historical event worldwide in its extent and effect. Those are two very important points of the creation model. Now, I want to take this model seriously. I want to do what Dr. Geisler asked us to do, that is, consider it on the evidence and compare this model with the evolution model. So let's look at the two side by side and compare them point by point with respect to a number of issues. Okay, this is also rather small, I'm afraid. But here we see what we would expect to get from the evolutionary point of view on this side. The animals that are buried in the deepest rock strata are expected to be different from those that occur at the top. Whereas on the creation model, the animals that are buried at the deepest rock strata are expected to be the same as those that appear at the top. Okay? That leads us to a very obvious way of testing these two models against one another. We can dig down into the Earth's crust, and we can see what we find. Let's take a look at it. Here we see it. This is just the fossil record for vertebrates, that is, roughly animals with backbones. And you see that certain kinds of animals, jawless fishes, you probably can't read it, occur at the very beginning and then die out. Mammals occur only relatively late, high up in the deposit. Birds, likewise. Reptiles start earlier and continue up to the present and so on. Just as the evolution model predicts, exactly contrary to what the creation model predicts. Okay, the debate is over right there. Simultaneous creation just simply isn't in the fossil record. Now, there are various ways in which people can try to get around this. They can invoke that great Noachian flood that I mentioned a few moments ago. And they can say, look, the reason we get these fossils in this order, it's a bit embarrassing that it looks as though it's the order that evolution suggests it would be, but perhaps they all got mixed up in this great big flood. And the things that were at the bottom of the seas when the flood hit got buried first, and so on. The especially agile creatures managed to resist the flood waters for longer and to get away. But let's take this story seriously for a moment. Suppose we believe that the fish would get buried first, and that land animals would get buried later, and that the really fleet and agile ones would get buried last. Unfortunately, there are lots of fish fossils, including fossils of bottom-dwelling fish, near the top. And there are lots of really slow-moving animals, like ground sloths, which are only found near the top. And then there are lots of much more agile land animals, all those dinosaurs, for example, much further down. Now, the plant fossil record is also quite interesting. You find ferns, plants that grow on land further down, with the flowering plants above them. And there are even various kinds of trees, the deciduous trees with which we're all familiar, that occur at the top, and only at the top. Okay, since they all live on land, I guess there's only one possible explanation, and that is that some of these trees were faster at getting away from the floodwaters than others were. Okay, now I've talked about a number of different cases. Let's look at one in detail. There are three kinds of animals that have developed similar characteristics, all of which lived in the sea. Here they are. At the top, an ichthyosaur, a marine reptile. In the middle, a shark. and at the bottom, a dolphin. All very similar in their habits, all living in the sea. Reptiles over here appear somewhat later and then go extinct. And at the very top, after the mammals are found on the land, what do we find? Dolphins. The fossil record is strikingly different from what it would be if it were to conform to the creation model. It's in exact accordance with what we predict from the evolution model. Okay, that's one kind of fact about living things that we can use to test these two models against one another. Here's another one. We can look at the present distribution of plants and animals on the Earth for clues to the history of life on Earth. We all know that different kinds of plants and animals are found in different places on our planet. Remember how the potato was discovered in this country and brought back to Europe. So you might ask the question, why do these animals and plants turn up where they do, or where they did before people intervened? Let's take just one example. Why do you find marsupial mammals, that is, roughly mammals with pouches, in great numbers in Australia and very rarely elsewhere? Evolutionists have an explanation. Marsupials first rose about 130 million years ago, during the reign of the dinosaurs. At that time, the continents were joined together. Okay? Continents joined together. And these early mammals could spread themselves around, not only over North and South America, but they could also get into Australia. Later, after the continents separated, okay, here are the continents separating until you come to the present, more capable placental mammals, that is, mammals like us, arose and beat out these marsupials where they could compete with them. But by that time, since the continents had separated, they couldn't get to Australia. So Australia served as a refuge for the marsupials, and they diversified there as nowhere else. Okay, well, what can the creationists say about this? Not very much. The first thing they have to do is to make up their minds about this flood. Now, I know that people who want to take the early chapters of Genesis literally are going to be very disappointed if Dr. Geisler or any other creationist tells you that the story about Noah just isn't true. But if it is true, then we ought to ask him, how did these marsupials get from Ararat in Turkey to Australia in 5,000 years? Well, that's a bit tricky. You'd naturally expect that all those hungry lions and tigers and bears and all would come charging off the ark and make life rather difficult for these poor marsupial mammals. They might even nip the journey in the bud. But even if you don't worry about that, how exactly did these animals make the journey? Well, you say, you've seen kangaroos in the zoo, they're fairly quick. Yeah, they are fairly quick, but they're not very good at jumping across large expanses of water. And there are lots of marsupials that are not so swift. For example, the koala bear spends most of its life in eucalyptus trees, munching eucalyptus leaves. Are we to suppose that there was some convenient line of eucalyptus trees stretching from Syria to Sydney so that koalas could periodically stop and have a little munch? And then there's this other character, the wombat. Very lovable, but somewhat slow-moving. In fact, wombats like nothing better than settling down in their own burrows and developing their elaborate social relationships. So how did all of these animals get there? How did they do it in 5,000 years? Well, actually, if you think there are problems after the beast left the ark, you ought to wonder about how they got on in the first place. Circuses have to go to enormous trouble moving their animals about. How did Noah do it? How did he adjust the temperature to meet the different requirements of different animals? Could he handle millions of insects with Bronze Age technology? How did he know he had one of each sex? How did he feed them, groom them, exercise them, clean up after them? Worse still, animals have specific parasites. Things like syphilis and gonorrhea are ours and ours alone. Someone on the ark must have carried them. So it's to imagine that people who are infested with all kinds of parasites and animals infested with all kinds of parasites packed in a wooden boat being tossed around in a convulsive flood. Now, you ought to say at this stage to yourselves, if not to me, that this approach to the Bible is offensive. I agree with you completely. It's not the way I recommend thinking about a great religious text. It's the way that's forced on us by people who demand that we treat the Bible not as a work of profound spiritual significance, but as the literal truth about Earth history. Seen in this way, it is vulnerable to just the kinds of comments and objections that I've been making. Seen in this way, creation science is not so much a victory for religion as the prelude to defeat. Let me move on to a last point. I want to compare the two accounts given by the creation model on the one hand and the evolution model on the other of the similarities and differences among living things. Evolutionists can explain this kind of thing. Let me start with a well-known example. Here are some forelimbs in various kinds of vertebrates. Okay, same bone structures being used as the forelimb, the arm in man, in Homo sapiens, the leg of a dog, paddle of a whale, and the wing of a bird. The same bone structures. What do those indicate? To the evolutionists, they indicate common ancestry, the relationship of these forms of life to one another. Take another example. Creationists love to make fun of the idea that mammals went back to the sea and evolved into whales. Well, let's take a look inside a whale. What do we see? Right here, a useless pelvis just hanging there, unattached in the blubber. And sometimes whales are even born with rudimentary legs that protrude from the body. Okay? Now, these are relatively superficial similarities that the evolutionary model can explain by citing common ancestry. These things turn up in unexpected places, and sometimes completely uselessly, sometimes counterproductively, precisely because animals share common descent. Well, we don't have to stay on this rather superficial level. Nowadays, we can ask detailed questions. They're called the siamangs. Here we have a creature called the gibbon. They produce hybrids. In fact, they're so close that by creationist criteria, they belong to the same kind. Now, I'm going to make a comparison. Here, we have the idea, the creationist idea, that there's an ancestral ape kind that gives rise to gibbons and siamangs. There, their chromosome numbers, they're rather different. The genetic distance between them, that's a measure of genetic similarity. The smaller that number is, the closer they are. It's quite small. The DNA hybridization temperature, the lower it is, the more similar the DNA. Okay? You see that they're quite close. But now let's look down here. Species A and species B are closer still. Their chromosomes are more nearly the same, and their DNA is more similar. Their genetic distance is perhaps slightly greater, but it's not really very great. So, if indeed the gibbon and the siamang evolved from the same ancestral kind as creationists say they did, then we should say presumably the same for species A and species B. What are species A and species B? There they are, species A and species B. And if you don't get a good view in that picture, try that one. Okay. Now, this is, of course, the very conclusion that the creationists don't want to draw. Thank you. But we can do even better than this in showing the similarities. And let me show you some very clear evidence of human kinship with apes. Okay. I'm going to skip this one and go straight on to our chromosomes. Here, on the right, you see the chimpanzee chromosome. On the left, the human chromosome. The banding patterns are exceptionally similar. And if we look at the one case in which the chimpanzee has one more chromosome than the human, you can see what's happened. Two chromosomes are fused, these two here, to give the human chromosome here. These kinds of banding patterns are clear evidence of genetic similarity. So, compared on 3 points, the fossil record, biogeographical distribution, and similarities among organisms as indicators of common descent, there's no debate. The evidence is conclusive. Thank you.
Next on the agenda is the first rebuttal, 10 minutes. And we will call on first Dr. Geisler.
Let me thank Dr. Kitcher for an excellent example of exactly what we're advocating be done in the public school science classroom, namely that both sides of the issue be presented. Notice how effective that was when he contrasted creation and evolution, when he presented the evidence, and when he drew his conclusions. Wouldn't that be wonderful if every one of our young people in all the high schools in America had the same chance of hearing in their science class the same approach presenting both sides of the issue as you had the chance to hear tonight? It's exactly what we're advocating. He's a perfect example of what I'm trying to defend here tonight, and I thank him for it. Secondly, let me put to rest a couple straw men that Dr. Kitcher mentioned. I am not advocating young Earth or flood geology. I don't believe in either. Since he had apparently nothing substantial to criticize in what I said, he had to create something to criticize. I don't accept either of those views. I don't hold young Earth. I don't hold flood geology. In fact, we mentioned exactly what we believed. We believed in a supernatural cause of the origin of the universe, of the origin of first life, and of new life forms. What I am advocating is freedom from indoctrination, freedom from public school children hearing only a creationist point of view, freedom of public school children hearing only an evolutionist point of view. What I'm advocating is freedom of speech, the freedom of a science teacher in a science classroom to teach a creationist point of view if that's what he believes. What I'm advocating is freedom of censorship, which censors systematically creationist books from high school libraries, which censors creationist views from scientific publications. What we're advocating is freedom from narrowness in science that believes that there's only one point of view that is legitimate, namely my point of view. Let me say something else that I think was a misunderstanding from what was said. Here's a fallacious argument. Humanism is a religion. Evolution is a belief of humanism. Therefore, teaching evolution is teaching religion. I think that's a fallacious argument. I also think it's a fallacious argument to say Christianity is a religion. Creation is a belief of Christianity. Therefore, teaching creation is teaching religion. I think both of those arguments are bad, and I think both creation and evolution should be taught as scientific theories in the public school classroom. You see, there are two views of origin. One's a naturalistic view and one's a supernaturalistic view. For 240 years, from 1620 to 1860, a supernatural view was current and common in scientific circles. For the last 120 years or so, a naturalistic view has dominated. Once creation was a majority view, now it's a minority view, and vice versa with evolution. We don't decide truth by majority and minority, but we allow both sides to be presented in an open marketplace. Here's how I think it should be presented. We should tell our young people in the public schools there's two possibilities with regard to the origin of the universe. Either it had a beginning or no beginning. If it had a beginning, either it was cause or there was no cause. Now, since science is predicated on the principle that there's an adequate cause for every event, then it seems to me that all we need to do is to ask, is there scientific evidence for a beginning? Because it is certainly scientific to predicate an adequate cause for an event, and if the universe had a beginning, then it is scientific to say there was a cause for the beginning of the universe. Dr. Kitcher is well aware of the second law of thermodynamics, which says in a closed, isolated system, not talking about open systems like plants, in a closed, isolated system such as the universe is, the amount of available or usable energy is decreasing, which means the universe is running down, which means the universe had a beginning, which has led even skeptics or agnostics like Dr. Robert Jastrow to say, and I quote, "Now 3 lines of evidence, the motion of the galaxies, the laws of thermodynamics, and the life story of the stars pointed to one conclusion. All indicated the universe had a beginning. Now, why in the name of reason, in the name of common sense, in the name of science, can we not tell young people in the science classroom there's evidence that the universe had a beginning and every event has an adequate cause, therefore it is plausible to postulate a cause for the beginning of the universe?" Dr. Jastrow goes on to say the most striking fact that science has discovered is there was a beginning of the universe. He even says science has proven the universe exploded into being at a certain moment. The scientists pursue the past ends in the moment of creation. Now, if an agnostic scientist who wrote a book, God and the Astronomers, can point to evidence of the beginning of the universe, and if it's rational to postulate a cause for events, then it's certainly plausible to be a creation scientist. Let me give another example of what we mean by creation science. The origin of life. Either it was spontaneously generated, or there was a special creation, an intelligent intervention. Now, with respect to science of the supernatural and science of the natural, there are two models that we could use. Either we could say that life began with no intelligent intervention, but was generated by purely natural laws known to physics and chemistry, or we can say that it took an intelligent intervention. Let me give you a model by which to build a creation science. A waterfall can be explained by purely natural laws: evaporation, condensation, precipitation on an incline over the edge of a cliff give you waterfalls. But a hydroelectric plant is never explained by purely natural laws. It always takes intelligent intervention. Same thing is true of wind erosion. The redundant patterns that you see in the Mojave Desert or the Sahara Desert, created by wind. You don't need God or an intelligent primary cause to account for wind erosion, but windmills always take an intelligent intervention. Windmills never result by purely natural causes. Or to take another illustration that's perhaps even more graphic, the Grand Canyon can be explained by purely natural causes. Strata being laid down underwater, building up over a period of time, erosion causing the Grand Canyon. You don't need God to account for the Grand Canyon.
3 minutes.
Purely random natural laws can explain it. On the other hand, no natural laws can account for the faces on Mount Rushmore. The faces on Mount Rushmore are not accountable by any kind of erosion, unless maybe it's political erosion. They're accountable only by direct intelligent intervention. Now, here's the question that is before us. The question that is before us is the first living thing more like a waterfalls or a hydroelectric plant? Does it have redundant patterns, or is it complex, specified complexity? DNA, and this picture was taken by the Institute for Molecular Biology in Dallas, a DNA splitting under electron microscope. There's enough information in a single cell animal to fill one volume of an encyclopedia. Now, here's what the creationists are saying. If life has such highly complex information, and if you see "drink Coke" written in the sky, you immediately think skywriter, not unusual storm. If you see your alphabet cereal spilled over on the table with your name and address in it, you'd first think somebody, intelligent being, was there, not the cat spilled it over. If you see a Boeing 747, you do not assume that a tornado raging through a junkyard produced it, because that kind of specified complexity takes intelligent intervention. This is a creationist model. The creation of the universe, the creation of life, and the creation of new life forms. Carl Sagan is one of the best examples of a creationist. He doesn't know it. The information content of the human brain is about 10 to the 14th bit. If written out in English, would fill 20 million volumes. Now, if it takes 20 million volumes to print the complex information in the human brain, and if every time we see that type of complex information printed, it came from an intelligent source, then certainly we have scientific basis for postulating an intelligent cause for the first living thing and for new life forms when they appear. Creationism is science. It's a viable science, and one of the reasons evolutionists don't want it taught is if it were taught fairly and objectively, side by side with evolution, few people would believe in evolution. Thank you.
Okay, second rebuttal. Dr. Kitcher.
Okay. Dr. Geisler spent most of his first presentation trying to extricate creation science from religion. Now, I'll give him that it can be extricated from religion. I'm not going to argue with that. My argument against the teaching of creation science in the classroom is not that it's religious, it's that it's lousy science. That's the problem with creation science. It's not that it's got some kind of religious background or anything like that. It's just not very good. Now, I started making my case for this last time by formulating the two models and comparing them with one another. Now, Dr. Geisler now wants to claim that the model that I compared with evolutionary theory isn't the real creation model. Well, I would be very grateful if one of these days the real creation model would stand up. One would think that the real creation model was the model outlined in Act 590, which was debated in Arkansas and in whose trial and in whose defense Dr. Geisler himself spoke. Act 590 says, first of all, that the sudden creation of the universe defines creation science. Sudden creation of the universe, energy, and life from nothing. The insufficiency of mutation and natural selection in bringing about development of all living kinds from a single organism. Changes only within fixed limits of originally created kinds of plants and animals. Separate ancestry for man and apes. Explanation of the Earth's geology by catastrophism, including the occurrence of a worldwide flood, and a relatively recent inception of the Earth and living kinds. That, I submit, is the creation model. That's the model I compared with the evolution model. That's the model I found wanting. But even if we relax, even if we say, all right, when you're not committed to all of that, what we need to know before we can bring creation science into the classroom is, what is this model? And what does it explain? The great thing about evolutionary theory, ever since Darwin, is that it has explained a lot of facts about the history of life, about the fossils we find in the rocks, the animals we find distributed over our globe, about their relationships to one another, and about the numerous imperfections in their design. Because one of the things that people who like to talk about a designing creator don't like to admit is that, of course, there are numerous imperfections in design. As people have pointed out, ever since Darwin, organisms are gerrymandered. That is, our evolutionary histories set us up with conditions which we must then adapt to solve our current problems. You can see this in numerous ways. Perhaps one that may be graphic for some of you is the design of the male reproductive apparatus in our own species and in all placental mammals. In placental mammals, that is animals that are born with a placenta, okay, the channels that take the reproductive tract have to loop around the urinary parts of the system. Happens all across the placental mammals. It leads to all kinds of problems for the males, as those of you who have had hernias and trouble with your prostates will know. It's a fact of bad design. Anybody looking at the male system can see how to design it better. But it's just a fact of our evolutionary past. Because we are the kind of animals we are, because we evolved from creatures who had certain conditions, our solution to the problem had to go that way. So, evolutionary theory is an explanatory theory. It explains all kinds of things. We are to compare it with nothing. There's no creation model, and there's no explanatory power that has been presented to us this evening. Okay. Now, Dr. Geisler wants to make a big fuss about freedom for teachers to do what they want, to do anything they want in the classroom, to teach views that are discredited. Does he want our medical schools to teach the four-humor theory of disease? Does he want our physics classes to teach flat earth theory? No, he doesn't want those things. He doesn't want them because he thinks, rightly, that those issues have been settled. So has this one. It was settled 150 years ago, 30 years before Darwin, when people, deeply religious people, realized that a strict, literal interpretation of the book of Genesis was not compatible with the facts of Earth history. And so Dr. Geisler talks in very vague terms about design and seduces you with visions of Mount Rushmore being produced in a purely naturalistic way. Yes, of course, In cases where we have no idea what natural process could have produced a phenomenon, we think in terms of intelligent design. But the great thing about evolutionary biology is that it tells us how a naturalistic account of the production of complex systems is possible. Now, I want to jog your intuitions about this by asking you to think about a very simple fact. All of you, all of the people in this room have brains, big brains, okay? All of you also developed from extremely small eggs. Okay, that came about by a natural process. We know something about the details of that process. We don't think that the details of your own individual development were guided by some intelligent being shuffling the molecules around. In exactly a similar way, evolutionary theory gives us an account of the kinds of changes that have gone on in the history of life and explains to us how complexity and apparent design come about as a result of purely natural causes. So the analogy with Mount Rushmore is quite fallacious. Okay? We are very complicated beings, and we understand how that complexity could have been produced, at least schematically and at least in outline, in natural terms. Now, I want to close my rebuttal by responding to a point that Dr. Geisler made in his first remark about the impossibility of evolutionary science, a science that looks at the past. Science, he said, trades on repeatable phenomena, things that you can observe again and again and again and again. Now, in my view, sciences that deal with the past and that deal with unique phenomena are still possible. And here's why. Because we can sometimes predict things that we will find in the present that are clues to the past. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 1950s, a Harvard entomologist, E.O. Wilson, and two of his colleagues speculated about what the ancestor of the ants would have been like. They drew a picture. They went on public record and they said, look, here's what we think the ant ancestor looked like. Nobody thought at that stage that there was much chance of finding fossil ants because such things are bound to be rare because ants are very delicate creatures. But they got lucky. One turned up, and it was almost exactly the same as Wilson's drawing. That is a remarkable case. It's a case where an evolutionist makes a prediction and the prediction comes out true. Here's another example. Remember my story about how the marsupials got to Australia? Well, if they got to Australia in the way I said they did, they would have gone through Antarctica. So perhaps we'll find traces of them there. In recent years, people have been able to look. What have they found? Fossils in Antarctica. So there's a simple reply to the claim that evolutionary science isn't scientific. We learn about the remote past in just the same way we learn about the recent past, by looking for signs that the past has left in the present. Everyone in this hall believes that enterprise is possible. When I find the cookie jar empty and my younger son with chocolate all over his face, I know what happened, even though I wasn't there to see it. Similarly, by testing hypotheses about the nature of the ancestors of ants or the routes that the marsupials took, I can build up knowledge piece by piece about the history of life on our planet. To those who try to stretch and twist philosophical jargon and build up elaborate false analogies about design and intelligence, I think it's appropriate to reply in the same straightforward way that Huxley once replied to Bishop Wilberforce. Better to admit our kinship with the apes than to use the advantages of a refined philosophical education to elaborate sophistries and illusory arguments. Thank you.